Okay, great. So the recorder's going. So my name again, I'm Peter Smallage. I'm the New York State Extension Forester. And I want to welcome you all to this December 17th, 2014 webinar on your woodland as a source of biodiversity. This is a presentation I saw Kristi give part of a couple of months ago, and I said, hey, that would make a great webinar. Kristi's a great webinar presenter. She's done a ton of her own webinars. So we're I was going to say we're going to be assured to not have any technological glitches, but I don't want to go that far.
That's a lot of pressure.
That's a lot of pressure for Kristi, but I'm sure it will be a very good presentation. Before we get started, I just want to offer you all the chance, if you want to save a copy of this presentation as a PDF. Is that okay, Kristi?
Yes, that's fine.
Okay, go to the File menu and select Save or Save As and save the document, and you'll be given the option to save it as a PDF or a UCF. So if you save it as a PDF, you'll be able to view it. There will be no sound, there will be no questions, it'll just be a file. If you save it as a UCF, you won't be able to open it. So save it as a PDF. And with that, I'm going to turn this over to Kristi. I see we have a participant that has sound issues, so I will work with Jim. And Kristi, the floor is yours. Thank you for joining us.
Wonderful. Thank you, Pete, and thanks to all of you for spending your lunchtime with us today. As Pete mentioned, I'm going to be talking about your woodland as a source of biodiversity and wildlife habitat. So I'm going to cover a wide range of issues and thoughts, and we will get started. So just to give you a little bit of an overview, I will address what landowners and land managers can do to enhance forest wildlife habitat and biodiversity. And we'll start with looking at the big picture, or your property as part of the larger landscape, looking at how to make connections among habitat patches and unique habitats that you can protect or encourage. Protecting aquatic resources, which can be very important in terms of attracting wildlife, and how to make your forest a little bit more complex or diverse in terms of the habitat elements, and therefore attracting a diversity of wildlife species as well. So I think the first thing to keep in mind whenever you're thinking about managing for wildlife is your own property and where it is in the context of the surrounding area. What kind of characteristics does the surrounding region have? Is it very heavily forested or not very heavily forested? And what elements are surrounding you? Because those elements in many instances can really affect the types of wildlife that you might expect to be able to have. And depending upon the size of your property, you may be able to influence that more or less. If you have a small property, then certainly the surrounding properties are going to have a big impact on what you might expect to be able to see on your property, no matter what you might do to manage it. So it's important to look at what the surrounding area looks like, think about it in terms of who owns the property, and that can give you a clue as to how it might be managed in the future. Think about what the structure of the forest is like, including, is it mostly mature forest, or is there a diversity of different forest ages? Those types of things can really help you kind of set the context for what you might expect. These days we have a number of excellent tools available to us to help us get the big picture. They're free and available online. Google Earth is something that you can download to your computer and get excellent images these days, and kind of take a look at your property and see what's around it and what's happening. Google Maps, you don't even have to download anything. You can go there and get aerial images. The same with Bing Maps. And so these are excellent tools that can help us kind of take a look at what's happening around us. And then we can start to think about, how our properties fit in. So, for example, in this picture, if you imagine that your property is contained within the red outline there, and think about, okay, what does my land provide that might not exist otherwise in the surrounding landscape? What do I have? What characteristics are important in terms of what wildlife might be in the area? And So in this case, if I owned what was within the red box, I would say that I own maybe the biggest central piece of forest in that specific area, and also a connecting corridor. I connect other forests to each other. So then I can think about how I might affect wildlife that's present in a larger area. If this was my forest, and within this red box, I look and I see that most of the surrounding forest is similar in structure, and it's almost all forest, not much difference in terms of habitat, not many openings. You can kind of see to the right here, I'll click my pointer, you can see that it looks like maybe in the past over in here, there may have been a harvest, maybe a different age structure. It looks a little bit different in terms of the texture when you look at that forest, but overall it's really a contiguous forest landscape. So if I wanted to add diversity here, I might think about creating different age structures in my forest through harvesting or other means, and or just creating some openings. If this was my property in this image, then I would look here and I think, what am I contributing to the habitat within the region? Well, it looks like I have a lot of evergreen or coniferous forest, and that's something that's unique to the area. So by maintaining that evergreen cover, I'm providing a microhabitat that's not really present in the surrounding area. Okay, then in addition to what types of, what the characteristics of my land might be, or how it fits into the bigger landscape, you can also think of your land in terms of making connections, either creating new connections or maintaining connectivity between and among different patches of habitat. A good way to do this is to maintain forest cover or encourage forest cover along riparian corridors, along streams. That's very important habitat to wildlife, and also can serve as a connection between forest habitat patches. And then you can also think about maintaining connections between forests and aquatic habitats, for instance, woodland pools and surrounding forest lands, or wetlands and surrounding either shrublands or forest lands. Because a lot of organisms that use aquatic habitats, we might think of them as aquatic organisms, especially amphibians and reptiles, but they oftentimes also depend on surrounding or adjacent forest lands or other terrestrial habitats. So maintaining connections between those two. Very few animals, I mean, when we think about a lot of our frogs even, they use water some of the time, and they're out of water a lot of the time. So if we want to think, even if you just own a small piece of land, you just have a backyard habitat, you don't have a large woodlot, the concept illustrated here in this slide really can apply to various scales and various sizes of properties. But you want to think about patch characteristics and how it affects habitat value. For example, the patch size and the proximity of the wildlife habitat patches to one another really can affect wildlife habitat. In the illustration A on the far left, you can see here's 4 properties with 4 small patches of habitat that are pretty isolated from one another, pretty far from one another, not really connected, not not too valuable in terms of wildlife habitat. But if you had those 4 properties, again, as you see in the illustration B, if you had the same size patches, but they were located a little bit more closely to one another, then that would increase the benefits. In C, you can see that they're located close to one another, and they're quite a bit larger, so the value starts to increase. And then you see in illustration D, those habitat patches have been expanded. They've become one large connected contiguous corridor of habitat, and that would be the most ideal circumstance. So that's one way to look at your land and looking at where forest patches exist nearby, and then thinking about where you might encourage forest if you don't have it already, or think about maintaining those connections. All right, so in addition to looking at the big picture and thinking about habitat connections, you can also think about the structure of your forest. So structure is very important to all wildlife species, and as forests change, either through natural succession or through management, the structure of the forest will change. So for example, you see on the left-hand picture on this slide, you can see that it's a pretty simple structure of the forest. There's not much understory. It's a very closed canopy. You have a lot of mature trees and not much in terms of ground cover or shrub cover or an understory forest layer. And that's unlike the picture in the right-hand side, where you can see that there's been a harvest. There's still some canopy remaining, so you have that layer of forest, but you also have a very thick shrub layer forming. The understory is growing up nicely there, and so the structure is just much different in those two pictures. And this is just to show, I'll be referring to vertical structure or vertical structural diversity, and you may hear that from time to time. And really all that is the diversity or the number of different layers of forest cover that you have within a forest. So overstory, midstory, understory, and shrub layer, in addition to the herb layer or the herbaceous layer, are the possible levels of structure you can have. And so the number of different levels that you have vegetation at is indicative of your vertical structure. Okay, and here's another image where there's been a pretty heavy partial harvest here. A lot of the canopy has been removed, and there's the understory layer starting to form here. And the number of different layers that you have is very important in terms of what types of wildlife species you'll have, and in particular in terms of birds, because birds tend to divide the habitat vertically. In other words, a scarlet tanager, for example, might use the overstory layer. Black-capped chickadee is a species that's found mostly in the understory. And then something like an ovenbird will use the forest floor. And by doing so, you can have a lot of different bird species in one given forest because they're using resources and space differently. So whenever you can have a diversity of those different layers, you'll have more bird species. I use a study that was conducted by Audubon New York to kind of illustrate these points. They looked at years ago, over 10 years ago now, but the results still apply today. They looked at a number of forests throughout New York State that were categorized into 4 different categories. Either mature, those were forests that were either uncut or had been thinned very lightly. A moderate partial harvest, where 20 to 30% of the tree canopy had been removed. A heavy partial harvest, where 40 to 60% of the tree canopy had been removed, and then a clear cut, where almost 100% of the trees, not quite, there have been some seed trees remaining, but most of the canopy was removed. And they went to look at how different forest management strategies affected songbird diversity and salamander diversity. So this slide shows what happened in terms of the response of redback salamanders. Redback salamanders are our most abundant salamander in Northeast forests. They're also the most abundant vertebrate animal in Northeast forests. We have many, many of them. So when, amphibians are very sensitive to heat and to dryness. They don't have anything to protect them from losing moisture from their bodies. And so, as you might expect, what they found in the different forest condition categories for redback salamanders was that as you opened up the canopy, allowed more light and heat to penetrate into the forest floor, you found fewer and fewer redback salamanders. Then they looked at birds, and they grouped birds into 2 different categories. One was early successional forest birds, which are birds that in the past had been known to or thought to prefer the young forest stage. And when they looked at those as a group, they found that, as you might expect, they were most abundant in clear cuts, where you would have that young early successional forest. They were fairly abundant still in a heavy partial harvest. They were definitely present in where there were moderate partial harvests, and they were even present in some of the mature forests. Then they looked at mature forest birds, those birds that in the past have been known to occur or thought to prefer mature forest conditions, birds like the ovenbird, for example. And interestingly, they were most abundant in mature forests. They were equally abundant in moderate partial harvest, where some of the canopy was removed. They still remained fairly abundant in heavy partial harvest, where quite a bit of the canopy was removed. And they were present, again, to some degree in clear cuts. So that was kind of an interesting finding. So just to put these two slides side by side together, you can see that if you are looking to have the greatest diversity or number of bird species, you might look at the moderate partial harvest or the heavy partial harvest as a place where you could have both mature forest birds and early successional forest birds. And that's because, going back to the vertical structure, with those two condition categories, you're maintaining some of the canopy layer, but you're also letting light in and encouraging those other layers to form. So that's where your greatest diversity of birds might be found. In an early, clear-cut condition, though, you would have a greater abundance of those early forest birds, and maybe, in more closed canopy conditions, you might have a greater abundance overall of the mature forest birds. But for diversity, kind of a mix is probably better. So the take-home messages for vertical structure are that forest management changes the vertical structure and the species composition. The resulting forest structure heavily influences the organisms that live there. So if you're an amphibian, you might not like it if there's a lot of light penetrating, but some birds do. Certainly reptiles would like those types of conditions. Mammals tend to be similar to birds, where some like an early successional forest and some like a mature forest. The highest species diversity probably occurs in the moderately or heavily thinned stands, and having a diversity of stand ages and structures in a region. So not necessarily within one ownership, but again, looking at the big picture, having a diversity of those structures across the landscape can provide habitat for many more species. Robert asked, assuming the Audubon study was soon after harvest, was there a follow-up a year or two later? And no, there wasn't. That study was conducted, I think, over 2 years, so 2 years of data collection. And it was, the Audubon study was done, so I guess no, the answer is no. They were looking at different forest condition categories at the same time, but not over time. Okay, so in terms of vertical structure, what's working against us these days? We have a number of things that are preventing us from being able to establish that diversity in structure. One here you can see in this picture, here's a forest. The canopy has been opened up to allow light to reach the forest floor. But you can see that this gentleman is standing in a sea of ferns, a sea of hay-scented ferns. So sometimes these days, with heavy deer populations, deer feed on species that they prefer, and that gives things like ferns the opportunity to become established and prevent seedlings from being established in the future. So we have a number of things preventing us from establishing these different layers, and one of the biggest ones is deer. To give you another example, this slide shows the area on the right and the area on the left are both part of the same harvest. They were harvested similarly, the same amount of overstory was removed. The only difference between the right and the left is that on the right-hand side, deer are excluded. You can see the fence going down the middle. Deer can't get into the right-hand side, and they can get into the left-hand side. And so you can see that there's a nice thick understory to the right where deer have been prevented from entering. And in the left, you can see that there's a lot of fern that's become established on the forest floor, not much understory structure at all. You can see, if you look right around the 5 or 6 foot high level, you see what we call a browse line, which is basically that deer are feeding and eating everything within their reach, up to 5 or 6 feet in height. So, it really decreases the amount of structural diversity that you can have in your forest. This is another example. This is a forest I was in just this summer. It's kind of a pole stage forest, so it is, you would expect, the canopy is fairly closed, but so you wouldn't expect to have a really robust understory layer because there's not a lot of light entering. But you can see that there is some sun entering and reaching the forest floor, and yet there's very little growing on the forest floor. And no understory layer whatsoever. Now, in other portions of that forest, there was some understory, but unfortunately, it was all Japanese barberry. So I just wanted to give you an overview of some of the research that's been done on deer density and how it affects not only the forest habitat, but in turn how it affects other organisms, other wildlife, and the abundance and diversity of wildlife that we might see in our forests. So this is a study that was done at Allegheny National Forest a number of years back. It was a long-term study where they actually fenced deer into large exclosures at these different deer densities that are shown in this slide. So at 10 deer per square mile, which is a very low deer density, 20 deer per square mile, all the way up to 80 deer per square mile, which is a lot of deer. And they looked at the number of songbirds that were observed in these under these different density conditions. You can see that the number of songbirds decreased as the density of deer increased in the enclosures. And that's because if we think in terms of how deer affect the vertical structure of the forest and kind of eliminating those understory layers, you can imagine that it eliminates the habitat for those songbirds that are dependent upon those layers and use those layers the most. So you'd have a decrease in songbird abundance. Years later, there was a follow-up study to look at these same enclosures to see if there was a legacy effect. Is there a long-term effect on deer density if deer densities are high? And so you can see that this is the number of deer on the x-axis here, the number of deer per square kilometer from 1979 to 1990. And you can see going from 0 to 30 deer per square kilometer. And you can see that bird density in 2008 continued to be lower even, like 20 years later, basically after the deer were removed. 20 years later, there was still a legacy effect on the bird density that was found in those areas. So when we have deer impacts on a forest, those forests can be very long-lasting and can leave a legacy of lower diversity for many years into the future. Here's another study that was conducted in New Jersey, and again looking at forest breeding bird species trends. This is from 1980 to 2005, and looking at the nesting location, categorizing how many birds were present, breeding bird species were present in the different layers that use the different layers of forest. So you can see that canopy nesters are tending to increase. That's the trend, is to having them increase or stay the same. But those who nest in the mid-story or the shrub or ground level, you can see wherever it falls below 0 here. See here, that's the 0 line. So wherever it's lower, they're decreasing, and wherever it's higher, they're increasing. So the canopy bird nesting species are increasing, whereas the others are decreasing. And again, that's thought to be in part due to the effects of deer on those different vegetation layers. Okay, and they also, for the Allegheny National Forest study that I showed you 2 slides ago, they also looked at caterpillar density according to those deer densities in the past, and saw that in 2005 caterpillar densities were still lower. And you might, one reason for this is because you have less vegetation in the understory, fewer leaves and stems. You would have fewer caterpillars, and also if you had maybe a lower diversity of tree species because of deer feeding on the ones they prefer and not the ones that they don't prefer, then you might wind up with fewer species of trees and fewer types of caterpillars that are living in that forest. So when it comes to food for birds, that's another reason that birds might be still lower in abundance in areas with high deer density, because the caterpillar density has been reduced over time as well. So overall, when you have a high abundance of deer, they've also found that it tends to increase the number of invasive species. It's almost like having a very disturbed forest floor, kind of a degraded plant community. It gives the opportunity for invasive species like Japanese barberry, which is pictured here in this slide, to kind of move in and fill in where native vegetation isn't doing so well because it's being browsed by deer. Deer tend not to browse invasive species as heavily. Those are species that they don't tend to prefer. So the structure, when you have something like Japanese barberry taking over the understory like you do here, that structure has been found to be favorable for deer ticks or black-legged ticks, which carry Lyme disease. And the Lyme disease infection rate also tends to be higher in these areas. So just in summary for deer, deer can prevent new forest growth. They can alter the species composition of the vegetation by feeding on certain species that they do like and not on other species, and that gives those other species a competitive advantage to grow and thrive in the understory. They can reduce plant and wildlife diversity by the effects that they're having on the vegetation, and high abundances can lead to an increase in invasive plant species. Another example of this is Delaware Water Gap National Recreation Area. They've done some research that showed that as hemlock woolly adelgid moved in and caused some mortality of hemlock trees, in those areas where you had high deer densities and hemlock mortality, there was an accelerated invasion of non-native plants like Japanese stiltgrass, garlic mustard, and Japanese barberry. And then again, there's a legacy effect. So the impacts that deer are having today are going to leave a legacy of effects far into the future. Okay, now moving on to some specific habitat enhancements that you can make or encourage. So timber harvest can change the forest structure and the wildlife community at kind of a medium to large scale, but even small scale changes can help to enhance habitat for many species. So no matter whether you have a clear cut or you have a mature forest, there are a lot of small things that you can do to make the habitat better for the species that are inhabiting your property. So some of those, one of the things you can do is to protect unique habitat features that you might have on your land. Things like rock walls that provide cover for small mammals and for reptiles. Some rocky outcrops some people might have on their land, especially on some of the ridges in Pennsylvania, for example. And old home sites can also, old foundations that are left from old home sites can also provide kind of a unique habitat feature. In this slide, the picture on the left is actually in Connecticut Hill Wildlife Management Area, which is a wildlife management area not far from Ithaca. And this is really an example of a practice that shouldn't happen, but turned out to be a really beneficial kind of habitat enhancement that occurred accidentally. This is an area where it's a very steep slope in the wildlife management area, and people were driving ATVs up and down the slope, and it really eroded the area, and so that it exposed the shale that was there, and not much vegetation was growing. Well, it turns out that there's a lot of shale going underground, and it seems that it's a very popular hibernating area for snakes, and a very rare lizard that lives in the area as well, the northern coal skink. And so in the early spring, a lot of these animals come out from underground and they move to this exposed rocky area where the sun's hitting, and they bask under these rocks. And it's really not very large rocks, but it's an area that we take our students to in the spring for class, and we look for reptiles under these rocks, and it's just amazing. They found like 6 different snake species and the coal skink, and actually many amphibians off to the side where it's more shaded and wooded. But it's just an amazing area where the animals tend to like warm up and fuel up before moving off into different parts of the forest for the summer. Okay, we can also protect and maintain aquatic features. Many, many different animals either are dependent upon water features for water, or they find a very important feeding areas because other animals are attracted to these areas and they can come there and feed. So by maintaining or protecting aquatic features on your land, you can really not only enhance the habitat for wildlife, but also increase your opportunities to view wildlife by visiting these areas. So one of the important habitat features that you can either create or maintain is a healthy riparian or riparian buffer, which is basically an area adjacent to a stream, or it can be a habitat buffer adjacent to a wetland. Basically any habitat that's kind of buffering a water feature. And so a healthy buffer will be wide. The wider the better, although you can see in the top right hand picture there, the forest is very wide on the right-hand side of the stream, very narrow on the left-hand side of the stream. Even narrow buffers are very important for protecting streams from erosion, and can provide some habitat benefits. But for wildlife, kind of the wider you can allow, the better. Not everybody has the luxury of being able to do that, though. Healthy buffers tend to have many types of plants. If you can have a diversity of structure within the buffers, that's excellent. They provide shade to the water, so in terms of something like a small cold water brook trout stream, that's really important. Trout are they love cold water, and so you're really helping to shade and cool the water. And then buffers have a high input of leaf litter into the stream, which provides the basis for the food web within the stream. So this is an example of a stream in New York State after one of the heavy flooding events. I think it was after Irene, possibly. But you can see that on the left-hand side of the stream where there was a forested buffer, and even upstream here where there was forest, the stream still looks good. It's still intact, not much problem. But down below where there was no vegetation other than possibly, some grassland, open field there was heavy erosion, and a lot of soil was moved, and there was a lot of damage done there. Even on a small property, even with a small water feature, you can have some pretty significant effects and do some great things in terms of habitat and stream erosion just by not mowing for a short distance next to these features. And so this is actually a picture of a small kind of ephemeral stream that runs down. It's actually more like a ditched area that the developer kind of dug deeper when he built the houses on either side. This is actually my yard on the left-hand side, and we noticed a lot of erosion happening along the banks, and I just stopped mowing for that's only a 2-foot wide buffer that I stopped mowing, and that's after one growing season, and you can see that it already has kind of stabilized the bank. And then on the right-hand side, that's what it looks like 12 years later. So lots of dogwood shrubs growing, a diversity of asters, and the birds just love it, and it's become great wildlife habitat. The turkeys actually move through that area to get to the other side of the road from the forest behind the house. So just something simple, like just not mowing a small area can have some really fun and interesting outcomes. Other habitat features that can be important, there's wetlands clearly can have very great benefits to a lot of different wildlife species. Even something like the upper right-hand picture in this slide is the overflow from a pond on our teaching and research forest here at Cornell. And that water feature is very attractive to things like spotted salamanders and wood frogs that lay their eggs there in the spring. So it doesn't look like much, but it has a lot of great benefits. Seasonal woodland pools, or you may have heard them called vernal pools, are very, very important habitats. And so if you have one in your woodland, it's a great place to go visit, take kids out to look for animals, and adults love them too. So a vernal pool or a seasonal woodland pool, which is what we tend to call them here in the East, because vernal implies that they're wet in the springtime, and our pools in the East tend to be wet both in the spring and the fall. And so if you go out in the spring or even in the winter time, you might see standing water in these areas in your woodlands. If you go there in the summer, so this is 3 pictures showing winter, spring, and summer at the same locations. And you can see that the summer picture here, there's no water. So if you just visited your woods in the summertime, you wouldn't even know that this important feature is here. So it's important to get out on your land, kind of see what's there in different seasons, and then you can make an effort to protect those special features in times when you might not notice them as much. So characteristics of woodland pools include, they're typically small in size, usually less than 2 acres. They're also typically isolated from other bodies of water, so they're not connected to a stream, and they're not connected to other features. They tend to be surrounded by forest. There are sometimes out in the open, but lots of times those get filled in, either intentionally or accidentally. They're shallow, and they tend to have a wet-dry cycle, like I showed in the last slide. And typically they don't have any permanent inlet or outlet of water. So they're either fed by groundwater below, or they fill in with surface water during rain events. So these areas provide breeding habitat for amphibians, some reptiles, invertebrates. A lot of bats like to come and feed over them as insects kind of hatch and come off the water. They provide foraging habitat for a lot of other species that come to these areas to feed. So a lot of mammals will come, raccoons and skunks and weasels, you name it. They will come looking for food in these areas. And they also are areas that by definition do not support fish. So fish are very significant predators of amphibian larvae, basically tadpoles and salamander larvae. And so the benefits of woodland pools are kind of decreased when there are fish in an area, and also the fact that they dry up periodically. They won't allow fish to be there because they need water all year round. So woodland pools have been described as like the coral reefs of the forest. Basically, a lot of animals come here, they breed, they lay their eggs, they go back out into the forest where they live, and then other animals come to these pools to feed. And so those processes mean that there's a lot of energy moved and transferred to and from these areas and back into the forest. Let's see, somebody asks here, are mosquitoes breeding in still water a problem with woodland pools? And that's a very interesting question, and we actually, at our teaching and research forest years ago, we created some woodland pools ourselves. And that was a question that we had from groups that we brought to see these creative woodland pools that we were suggesting as a way to enhance habitat. And so we had an intern working in these pools, and what we basically did was we looked at spotted salamander larvae, and we fed them mosquito larvae, as many as they could eat per individual per day. And on average, they were eating about 40 mosquito larvae per day. And so that's a lot of mosquito larvae. And so I think essentially if you have a very healthy ecosystem and you have all those members of the community that you should have there, that the mosquitoes aren't going to do so well because they're being eaten by these salamander larvae, and which are pretty much, they're very voracious predators. In fact, we had a couple in a container at once, and we learned very quickly that we had to put only one individual in there at once because they were feeding on each other if we didn't keep them separated. So I think as long as your ecosystem is nice and healthy and you have all those components, then mosquitoes aren't going to be a very big issue. So I talked before about the importance of maintaining connections between aquatic habitats and upland habitats, and some of our woodland salamanders are a really good example of why this is important. So for example, the spotted salamander, which I showed you, let's see here, this black salamander is really nice with yellow spots. And this salamander here, the Jefferson salamander, they're called mole salamanders. They come out early in the spring. They move to their breeding pools where they lay eggs. They breed and lay eggs, and then they go back to the forest for the rest of for the rest of the year, basically. So they're dependent upon water features to complete their life cycle, but they're also very dependent on forest habitats. And so you can see that these animals travel, pretty great distances from their pools for the rest of the year. All right, so there, in addition to enhancing or protecting very important kind of unique habitat features, you can try to enhance the structural complexity of your forest in other ways. And one of the most important ways, I think, is to retain large dead and living trees. And I really encourage trees with cavities or holes in them. I really think that no matter what the condition or the structure of your forest overall, if there was one thing that you could do to enhance habitat for a variety of species, it would be to really focus on retaining or creating these dead trees. So snags, snag is another term for a standing dead tree, and a lot of different animals use them. Woodpeckers will use them. They will excavate holes. Then there are other species called secondary users, like a black-capped chickadee, for example, that doesn't actually excavate the hole but moves in afterward. A lot of animals use them either for roosting, so just hanging out at night, for example, or during the day, depending on what the species is. For nesting, they use them as feeding sites. A lot of insects, a lot of fungi growing on these dead trees. And some animals use them during the winter time for hibernation sites. So why bother? So there are over 35 species of birds and 20 species of mammals in Pennsylvania, for example, that require cavities for nesting, and reptiles and amphibians also use cavities for shelter at some times. Sometimes it can be quite a surprise. If you're looking for animals in cavities, you never know what you might find. One time I was doing a nest search for nesting birds in cavities, and I poked my head in, peered into a hole, and there was a large black rat snake. But they are used by a whole diversity of animals. And here you have that nice bear at the base of a large tree with a big cavity in it. And then you also have things like the screech owl pictured at the right. And here's my just a survey of some of the really neat creatures that inhabit cavities. Here you have a flying squirrel, you have a saw-whet owl, a mink, and a raccoon. Wood ducks use cavities, and bluebirds, and the Indiana bat, and martins and fishers. Squirrels and porcupines, a variety of woodpeckers. The tufted titmouse, the barred owl, the chickadee, again the downy woodpecker, and some small mammals like mice. Just a small sampling of the diversity of species that use cavities and dead standing trees. So sometimes cavities are in live trees and sometimes they're in dead trees, and both are very important. Different species will use cavities in dead and or live trees. So in terms of managing for dead trees, some of the guidelines suggest retaining at least 4 snags per acre. And so if you don't have 4 standing dead trees per acre, it is possible to create them by girdling the tree, and that's what's shown here. This tree has been, you basically take a chainsaw and you can cut around the tree. You don't cut, all the way through, just a couple inches in. And oftentimes you have to double girdle it. So you see here there are basically two spots where it's been girdled. And then over time, the tree will die, and then it will become a nice tree, a nice habitat tree for wildlife. Now, clearly, if it's an important timber tree, and you're managing your forest for timber, you don't want to pick your best. You want to pick things that trees that might be competing with your better trees, and trees that maybe aren't in the greatest condition to begin with. Okay, so this is looking toward the future. If you do have a harvest, you can think about leaving some trees standing to provide future cavities in downed logs. So maybe you don't, even if you have a clear cut, you want to maintain some trees in the clear cut to provide that legacy. And you can have retain groups of legacy trees, or what are called patch reserves, to try to provide cavity trees and snags for the future, and also down logs on the forest floor. And that leads me to leaving wood on the forest floor. So wood on the forest floor is equally important to wood that are trees that are dead and standing. They provide cover for wildlife, nesting sites. Turkeys like to nest on the ground on the back sides of logs on the forest floor, germination sites for seeds. Some seeds germinate very well on dead wood on the forest floor that's kind of rotted and degraded. A lot of different animals, amphibians, reptiles, small mammals. So it's very important to leave wood on the forest floor, just in terms of habitat structure and a habitat element. And again, things like ruffed grouse might use them as drumming sites. There are lots of different uses for these downed logs. Snakes like to use them. And what we did a number of years ago, we had an intern project. We had a log landing with a pile of the butt ends, the ends of the logs that weren't taken during the harvest. They were kind of left behind. And in the past, it's been kind of the best management practice in terms of logging aesthetics to sometimes even to bury those logs underground so it doesn't look unsightly. But we started finding actually the northern coal skink, which is this lizard pictured here. We started finding the coal skink in areas where these logs were retained or left on the landing. And so we started a research project to look at landings with and without these piles. And we'd kind of go around and enhance some of the piles, make them a little bit bigger on some of the log landings. And then we compared the animals that we found on sites with the piles to the animals we found on sites without the piles. And what we found was really remarkable. We had 4 landings with piles and 4 without piles. And as you can see here, only 1 of our landings without piles did we find the snakes or coal skinks on. Whereas on 3 of the landings with piles, we did find a variety of snakes, and 2 of them had the coal skink. So we had garter snakes, red-bellied snakes, the Decay's brown snake, ringneck snakes, milk snake even, and the coal skink on 2 of those. So just by leaving those butt ends on the log landings, we were able to enhance the diversity of reptiles using those landings. And that's something you can do even if you just have an opening on your property. It doesn't have to be as a result of a timber harvest. Any opening, if you have some wood that you can pile up and make a large brush pile, or even something bigger like this. This is a pretty big pile. It's about 5 feet in height. So we've been doing a lot of research over the years looking at the effects of leaving treetops after timber harvest and how that affects wildlife and a lot of little microhabitat conditions. Lots of times in the literature we hear terms like woody debris and slash and what we call other misnomers. Mostly it's a kind of a negative connotation, but it's really beneficial stuff, and so we've been looking at what those benefits might be. So we've been doing some studies where we've had basically all of the branches removed after a harvest. You can see here on the left You know, a lot of people like that kind of look. It's very open, park-like. It's clean and manicured, and as human beings, we tend to like things that are you know, look nice like that. But we've been looking at retaining the branches on the forest floor, the treetops following a timber harvest, and what some of the benefits might be. And what we've been doing is, this is an example of a pile of treetops that are left behind, and we've been looking a lot at temperature and how they affect the forest floor temperature, and in turn the organisms that might live there. And we've used these data loggers, these little round things. They basically record the temperature at set intervals. We usually set the intervals for every 4 hours, and it records the temperature without us even being there. And we can download the data and look at months of temperature data. And so we've been comparing the temperatures at ground level within these sheltered areas, within the tops and outside of the tops. We've also looked at how much wood to leave on the forest floor. So here, we've left everything 10 inches or smaller, which is a lot of wood on the forest floor. Here, we've left everything 4 inches or smaller, which is a moderate amount. And here, at our other treatments, we've removed the entire treetop from the site. So there's very little wood whatsoever on the forest floor. In this graph, you can see that what this is showing is just one data logger, one of those little round temperature recorders over time, so from June all the way through September. And it's looking at the temperature either in the open site, where there's no treetop on the bare soil, which is in red, or within the treetop, the pile of treetops, and that's in black. And what you see here is that for the most part, you can see in black that the temperatures don't get as high underneath the piles, where they tend to be higher and also fluctuate quite widely where there's no wood left on the forest floor. So having those piles can help to kind of mediate the temperature extremes that you might find on the forest floor. And it's very important for things like salamanders, again, amphibians that don't like those really hot temperatures. And also, you know, it can be very beneficial in terms of not allowing the forest floor soils to dry out as much. So we've measured soil moisture and water retention to see if these piles are helping to retain soil moisture in the forest. And the blue lines, this is just 4 examples of piles versus an open site and soil moisture. And you can see that the trend, this is 4 examples, 4 different pairs. And blue is where there are treetops left, and red is where it's just in the open area with bare soil. You can see that in each of these examples, the treetops tend to have higher soil moisture underneath, and also they tend to stay moister for longer periods of time. We use salamanders as a proxy for ground-dwelling organisms. They're very sensitive to the environment and to environmental change, again, temperature and moisture and the amount of cover. And so we look at those to see, you know, what the effects are to organisms. You can see that here we look at, again, the 10-inch treatment, where we left a lot of wood on the forest floor, and the 4-inch treatment had far more salamanders, redback salamanders, than the whole tree treatment there, where all the wood was removed. So leaving wood is having benefits on our study sites to salamanders specifically, and probably other organisms as well. We also looked at vegetation. So can treetops left on the forest floor affect regeneration of tree seedlings, mostly by preventing, kind of being natural barriers to prevent deer from being able to get in and browse and feed on those seedlings. So we had our interns out there doing lots of surveys over a number of years, and basically what we found is that, you know, pile within the pile of treetops is shown in green. In the open areas without any treetops is shown in white. You can see that both species richness and seedling density, the number of seedlings, so the number of species and number of seedlings, tends to be higher under the piles or coming out of piles than in the open. And here's just a visual to show how what that looks like on the ground. So this is in one of our 10-inch treatment sites where we have a lot of wood in piles. Again, you know, they're pretty sizable piles of treetops, and resulting from, you know, leftover after a harvest. You can see that the deer, you know, this is outside There's not much seedling growth out here, but here within this pile, there's quite a bit of seedling growth. Some of them are well over 2 meters, past where deer can reach them anymore. You can see that the deer basically browse as far as their necks would reach, and then as you get in further into the pile, the vegetation height gets higher. So in at least some instances, they can be very beneficial for preventing deer from browsing. And this is just another picture showing an area where the treetops had been removed, and there's hardly any woody vegetation regenerating. This is a lot of goldenrod, herbaceous vegetation, versus here, a treetop at the same site, different treatment, where treetops were left, and there's a lot of vegetation, so more structural diversity there. So to summarize, wood does matter, and it matters in terms of microclimate, in terms of mediating the forest floor temperature and retaining soil moisture, in terms of maintaining biodiversity, so salamanders, for example, and in terms of regenerating our forests. It can increase seedling survival and growth, increase seedling abundance, and lead to greater tree species diversity, hopefully in the future. Just to summarize, for wildlife and biodiversity, messy is often best. So I love this quote that I saw, diversity is the key to stability. Quite contrary to human garages, this apparent messiness of nature is actually one of its greatest assets. And so I will end there, and I thank you all for joining me.
Kristi, great job. Thanks very much. So we have some time for questions. We have many participants. That's super. So if anyone has questions, this would be the time to add them into the chat box. If you haven't activated your chat box, then there's a gray icon in the upper right-hand corner that says chat, and if you click on that, it will turn from gray to blue, and then your chat box will open. So any questions for Kristi? There is one from Michelle, wants to know if tree species matter.
Let's see. So Michelle, I'm going to assume you mean does the species of tree that's left in the wood pile, does that matter? And I would say probably not. It's going to matter in terms of how long it takes for that wood pile to break down. So some of the softer woods might break down more quickly. And the reason the bigger piles, I think, tend to be a little bit better is that they don't break down as fast. And so if you can maintain a pile and that structure of the pile for 3 years or more, it gives a greater opportunity for seedlings to grow and get past the height where deer can reach them. The smaller piles have benefits in terms of temperature and even in terms of salamander use, but I think they, after one winter, you'd be surprised how much after a heavy snowfall in one winter, how much they kind of compress and break down. So I think smaller piles or softer woods might break down more quickly, and if you have heavy deer browsing pressure, it might be more important to have either a bigger pile or a harder wood component maybe that might not break down as rapidly.
Okay, so you have some questions. Do you see those questions, I assume, yes. Kristi, or should I read them? Okay, go ahead.
No, I think I'm good there. How do you choose to keep some of the, or do you, to keep some of the aggressive understory things like bush honeysuckle? Well, I guess in terms of some of the invasive species like the honeysuckle, if you have them, it's going to prevent other trees and shrubs from growing. And so I would say for the most part it can be a negative. There are some studies out there that have shown that some of the invasive species, some of the berries even, are not as good for wildlife. They don't have as much nutrition, so even though birds will eat them, and after eating them will spread the seeds to other places, they're not as good in terms of a food source. The structure of those patches of honeysuckle also have been shown to sometimes lead to lower nesting success for some songbirds. So if you could remove them, it would be, I think, a good thing to do. However, if you have a large stand of honeysuckle, it can be very challenging to get rid of those. So I would say if you could leave them, leaving some means that in the future there will be more. So whenever you can remove them, I think it's a good thing to do. Let's see, we have a question. When looking to create a snag, what is the best diameter tree to choose? The best diameter tree, it's actually, they recommend retaining a number of different sizes, actually. A couple that are very large and a couple that might be a more medium size. And there are specific recommendations out there. Let's see, there is a very good book by Dick DeGraff, and I'm going to try to reach it here on my shelf so I can get you the title, that has a lot of good recommendations. It's called Forest Wildlife, the Technical Guide to Forest Wildlife Habitat Management in New England. And there's the technical guide, and then there's a landowner's guide that's kind of a companion to that. And those two publications are excellent resources in terms of specifics to manage for wildlife habitat. The technical guide is more for land managers, foresters, and the landowner guide is a little bit less technical, so it's a good guide to have. But really, they say a diversity of sizes, and also some in live trees and some in snags. How can you create a woodland pool is a question. That's kind of a tricky question. It really, okay, so first I think it's best to always conserve a pool that you have and protect it rather than creating a new one. A lot of people will look at a woodland pool and think it's just kind of a messy area again, and they'll want to dig it deeper to make a pond. So it's best to just not, if you have one, not to try to make it better, because sometimes you can actually wind up draining it accidentally. The soils that you have in your forest can affect whether or not you're able to create a woodland pool. There is also a guide to creating woodland pools out there that's pretty good, but the way that we've done it at our teaching and research forest is twofold, actually. We've dug some by hand, and that can be quite an effort. And those are, pretty small ones. We've had woodland pools created following a timber harvest. So we've had the logger just kind of drop his blade and push out an area that we know is wet. We've monitored it. We know that there's a lot of runoff coming down the hillside, and just had him basically push out a very shallow area. And we're fortunate where our teaching and research forest is that basically whenever you create a depression, it fills with water and stays that way. So, but not everyone has those the right types of soils, and so I would say, look for a guide. There is a guide to creating vernal pools out there, and you can get a lot more detailed information. Also, in some areas, there are permits required for moving soil, and so you should always be very careful about local ordinances and rules that you might need to be aware of. And that guide, again, has a lot of those details in it. Let's see, / decomposition, returning nutrients to soil. Yes. So Richard just has that as a question. And yes, / is really important. And again, I'll call it woody material, trying to get away from the / context, but it definitely returns nutrients to the soil, especially the smaller branches at the tops of trees tend to be more nutrient rich. And let's see, John plans to construct 2 vernal pools on his property next year. How long does it take for a newly constructed pool to become functional? Well, that is a great question. And the pools that we created at the Arnott Forest, it was a very dry summer. It was August, and the pool basically only about a puddle. So the hole was kind of pushed out. There was just a small puddle there, and a green frog appeared just like that. So some organisms have a knack for finding sources of water. Green frogs certainly do. But I would say by the following spring, it was starting to look like a pool, and maybe a full year and a half later, you could hardly even tell that it had been a disturbed site. What we did was, when we had the logger removed the soil from the, and create the depression, we had to retain the topsoil along the side, and then scattered that along the banks. And that way the soil seed bank was still there, and so the plant species that were growing in the area grew very quickly along the edges. We also threw in some logs and sticks actually back into the bottom of the pool before it filled with water to provide egg attachment sites for amphibians, and some organic matter to start serving as the basis for the food web there in the pool. So it was, for us, it was very quick, and I'd say by the first spring we had some, at least wood frogs, laying eggs in the pools. Let's see, I have a question. Do you know of studies where artificial hiding places were put in to the whole tree harvested area, something like plywood squares placed around the site? I don't know of any studies that where that was done, in the context of removing whole trees after a harvest from an area. But the way that we measure salamander abundance in one area as compared to another is to use not plywood squares, but we use rough cut lumber, and we put maybe like 14-inch pieces by maybe 8 inches to 10 inches wide out on the forest floor, and that way we're able to monitor those pieces of wood and compare the numbers within two different types of habitat, or in our case, near piles and in the sites where the whole trees were removed. So just using rough cut lumber and boards and placing them out in a site is also a habitat enhancement technique that you could use on your own property. They're also great educational tools because salamanders will start to use those boards and they'll return to them, and you can take students out, or even groups of adults, and you can lift the boards and look under and find those animals. Okay, yes, and John Howard, yes, did say most nutrients are concentrated in slash less than 4 inches in diameter. So thank you for that, John. Do I know of any studies examining the effect of deer abundance on woodland pool health? No, I don't actually, and if anybody does, I'd be very interested in knowing about them. I could definitely imagine that deer abundance could affect the surrounding forest health, and therefore the success and or failure of the organisms that use the woodland pools, but I don't know of any specifically. That's a good question. Okay, could I post the book and author name? Let's see, yes, I'll do that as soon as I'm done here. Or Kristi, did you do that, Pete?
Yeah, I posted it further down. I just called it Wildlife Technical Guide, and then I put a link to I think it's University of New Hampshire has it available for sale, University of Vermont.
Okay, all right, great, thank you, Pete.
But So if somebody types into Google Technical Guide to Forest Wildlife Habitat Management New England, you'll get several options. Google sells it, Amazon sells it, New Hampshire sells it, Vermont sells it.
Okay. Let's see, we have a question. How does farm animal impact the biodiversity of forest? I'm not exactly sure what context you mean, Francisco, but I could imagine, sometimes, for example, Pete's been involved in some projects looking at animals and silvopasturing, it's called, where you actually do put animals into the forest, and certainly goats have been used for invasive species control, to browse invasive shrub species that are growing in the understory of a forest as kind of a restoration technique, and that sometimes can be very beneficial. Otherwise, sometimes it could have a negative effect. So I think it depends on the context, and certainly Pete has some silvopasturing. You have a silvopasturing webinar from the past, don't you, Pete?
Yes, yeah, on YouTube at the Forest Connect site. So, and you're right, Kristi, it depends on how you use the animals. So the animals are going to provide some type of vegetation management treatment. If you're intensive with it, then it's going to have an impact that could remove all vegetation and take it down to bare soil. Or if you're more deliberate about it, you might develop essentially a grassland forage base in the forest, so you'd have a simplified but a unique vertical structure that would be different. So it depends on how you do it. There's like everything, there's a right way and a wrong way to do it.
Okay, thanks, Pete. There's a question from Sheila. We have depressions that hold water only a few days. Can we improve them? Well, you may be able to if they hold water only a few days because they're in open areas. Sometimes if you can encourage tree canopy closure near those open areas, you can prevent them from the water from evaporating as quickly. So providing shade might be one way. You know, even areas that only hold water for a few days can be beneficial to something like American toads. Toads are they basically have no self-respect, I say, when they choose their breeding habitat. Sometimes just a tire rut filled with water for a few days is enough for them to lay their eggs, and the eggs hatch very quickly, and the tadpoles develop very rapidly and emerge onto land. So even something like a toad can use something that holds water just for a very short period of time. Okay, and there's some comments from Stephen Wood. Thank you, Stephen, for the suggestions in terms of whole tree harvest. All right, Rosemary asks, she mentions that storms have brought down many trees. Some are in wetlands, and should we leave those trees down in the wetlands? Some people want to clean it up by chipping. Rosemary, I guess my take on that would be, as long as it's not something that's going to maybe impede water flow or, cause a hazard, either to maybe lead to road flooding or something that might be hazardous to people. I would say there's nothing wrong with leaving it, especially, in wetlands. Turtles love logs to bask on, and so it can have a lot of benefits. And in my experience, wood breaks down fairly rapidly. It's a pretty ephemeral thing that you're going to have very short term, and so putting a lot of effort into it, a lot of time and money, when it can have some benefits to habitat, just doesn't. It seems like sometimes just leaving it is the better and easier thing to do. Okay, Rosemary also asked, can we use tree sections to surround new tree plantings for protection? Use what is there to protect? That's a great question, and I think in some cases you can. I have a coworker who has done that, kind of made, I don't know how to describe it. I guess maybe like a corral, like a square corral almost around sections in his woods, smaller sections to allow, almost like a natural fence barrier in small areas to protect seedlings, and has had some good success there. So I think in some instances you could, as long as they're large enough and they do prevent, serve as barriers, and large enough in terms of being high enough to prevent deer from wanting to get in. Yes, buckthorn is difficult to control, and again, I think Pete has a nice webinar formerly recorded about controlling invasive species. You do, Pete?
Yes. Yep. There's a couple actually. So if you go to all of the webinars are archived on YouTube at this site. So if you go to youtube.com/forestconnect, and you can search for shrubs or herbicides or invasive plants, things like that, and you'll see what's available. But we have a couple on herbicides. We have a couple on flame weeding. Buckthorn is, in my experience, the hardest of all of the woody shrubs to control. So.
Okay. And Rosemary, I see you've asked about leaving slash and woody debris to protect new trees, or you've mentioned it. In addition to leaving slash and woody debris, if you have a lot of new seedlings that you're planting, there are also tree shelters and other mechanisms that can be used to protect new seedlings from foraging by deer.
Kristi, I don't see any more questions, and unless you see any, I want to take this opportunity to thank you again. This was a really fabulous presentation. Many people commented to that effect, so it's not just me that thinks it was a great presentation.
So thank you.
Yeah, right. A vote of one. No, there's a vote of many. So thank you, Kristi. This has been recorded, and I will upload it to the YouTube site. And when you all leave, you're going to be directed to the exit survey. So if you take just a minute to complete that, that would be helpful. And with that, I will call this to a close. And for those of you that want to see this again, Kristi will be back again tonight at 7 p.m. So thank you all and have a great afternoon. And Kristi, we'll chat about 6:45.
Okay, sounds great. Thank you, Pete, and thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.